we've gone through people and how you deal with the limitation of the movement of people while keeping the flow of capital and information going. So that seems to have a logic into it. But then comes the thing in between, which is goods, right? So what do you do with goods? Capital must flow, people must not flow, unless they're the right kind of people who know what the flow of capital means. But then you have this reemergence, especially with Donald Trump 2.0, of tariffs and of protectionism, something that was an absolute taboo for the globalist neoliberal. And I'm not sure even that your libertarians that you just described were very much keen on that either. So where does that come from, and how will it fit with the rest? So,
So one thing I think it's helpful to ask oneself is, what is the kind of model of economic activity that neoliberal intellectuals have in mind when they make their visions of the future or their proposals of how to fix the problems of capitalism and democracy and tension? One of the things I sort of only realized in retrospect with globalists is that it was really mostly about trade. It was mostly about an international division of labor in which some things were manufactured some places and others other places, and you needed to create an architecture to prevent, blockages and obstacles from the movement of goods from one place to the other. The world of zones that I introduce in Crack Up Capitalism is also very much based in some ways on manufacturing. It's about the outsourcing of the supply chain out across long distances, so that with the container ship, transport costs fall basically to nothing, and you can do something even as trivial as make a t-shirt or a sweater in 3 or 4 different countries. And when it goes from country to country, it's going into mostly export processing zones. So these offshore, onshore places that are somewhat in but separate from the host country, but that allow for kind of tapping into market arbitrage, finding the lowest wage, finding the lowest site of production, and then delivering at the lowest price point to the consumer. So to think about the problem of global governance through the lens of trade, I think, offers you one set of solutions. And it's the kind I offer in Globalists, which is it can be good to have a kind of top-level framework of encasement to kind of lock in this very complex labyrinth of exchanges and supply chains. If you think about it, the problem in terms of finance and money rather than goods, then you get a kind of a different, I think, vision of how the globe should be governed. I think there, and this is one place I think you have a really important insight in rated agency, was that the neoliberals of the kind of early 20th century sort of didn't really reckon with the explosion of finance in the 1990s and early 2000s, and actually the basic ungovernability and the ways in which finance is not like trade, right? That creating money in huge quantities through private institutions, creating massive new debt instruments out of thin air, as long as you can find a customer for them, produces a kind of unwieldy sort of swirl of value, which isn't really amenable to the same kinds of institutional arrangements that can govern something that in the end is a material t-shirt that moves from one place to another. What happens when you can just click your fingers and create enormous amounts of money and thereby value in the traditional liberal sense immediately? I think that much of the chaos of the present moment is a kind of outcome of that runaway process of financialization, which produced a kind of world historical level of wealth in a small number of people, which is now sort of swamping the efforts at creating an orderly model of trade governance in the kind that the mid-century neoliberals would have hoped for. So the way that the stock market after the global financial crisis was, juiced so hard by quantitative easing, driving stocks up the way it did, mostly driven by a small number of tech stocks, producing now this overclass of a small number of incredibly wealthy tech billionaires who in effect have now been able to co-opt the government for their own means that, what's best for Tesla or Bitcoin is now becoming the question of how the United States operates. So this is a sort of a long roundabout way of getting to the tariff question, but I think that what we see now is a kind of, a billionaire class, which often still does make things, but which has been, empowered to an extraordinary degree by the unleashing of unregulated finance in the last 30 years, which is now trying to figure out what kind of trade regime works best for it. One can explain, I think, the appearance of someone like Musk into the Trump campaign as an effort to kind of bear hug the potential president and prevent a kind of tariff policy that would be too detrimental to his own interests. So taking on board now that some version of the use of tariffs as an economic weapon will be part of a new Trump administration, as we already know. The desire, I think, of an Andreessen or a Musk was to make sure that this didn't hit them too hard in the markets that they really depend on. For Musk, that means China. So it's surprising already what we know that Mexico and Canada are being hit with higher tariffs than China itself. So that's, I think, part of the story here is that this sort of insurgent tech libertarian community sees tariffs now as a kind of part of governance, and they're trying to make sure that it doesn't hurt them too much. Is the tariff as an economic weapon sort of consistent with any version of neoliberal philosophy or neoliberal ideology? Basically, no. The short answer is no. The longer answer is that it depends what you're using the tariffs for. Reagan made use of aggressive, not necessarily tariff policy, but non-tariff barriers to trade, so-called voluntary export restraints, import quotas, subsidies at a high level, often for the same reason that Trump and Biden did, which is to protect the American semiconductor industry, in particular, the American automobile industry in particular, from competition from more efficient and better products. Then it was Japan, now it's China. So if you try to understand the nature of Reagan's trade policy, you would, I think, make a distinction between tariffs that are being used to open up foreign markets for American products and tariff policy that's being used to create more levels of independence and self-sufficiency. So I think if there is a kind of a neoliberal kind of tariff, it's in the model of what's been called competitive liberalization. So you use tariffs to kind of open up markets that had been previously more protected and to, increase access for your nation's own products. But even then, doctrinaire neoliberals would look very skeptically at this use of an overt economic weapon rather than, fighting it out more in the space of products and the market.
But it's a threat. In this case, it would be basically a threat to make sure that the American companies that are purchasing or have purchased part of the American state are not harmed in other countries.
Yeah.
However, that can create problems in return on the import level. And that presents a problem because, after all, neoliberalism in all its different variants have relied very much on the import of, especially in the US, of cheap products because since the salaries, the wages are stagnant, that's the only way that you can prevent impoverishment. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the reason I think I'm kind of laboring over the answer is that I think the way it's narrated popularly is often overly clear-cut and simplistic, which is that, the tariff is an old-style economic weapon. It brings us back to the 1930s or the 1890s. Therefore, it's kind of backward-looking and the opposite of free tradeism and a globalizing marketplace. Not necessarily. I think the tariffs can be used to advance economic globalization. I think that the fact that part of Trump 1 was trying to get greater enforcement of things like intellectual property rules and WTO rules inside of China shows us that, sometimes this sort of aggressive tariff policy can be in service of locking in more legalized versions of free trade, right? It can be a way of getting to that endpoint. Or it can be a version of, or in the interest of decoupling and delinking from China altogether, which is a very different outcome. So I think that that's what I want to sort of draw attention to, is the tariff as a weapon that can be used for diverse purposes. And some are more acceptable to neoliberals than others. However, I think grosso modo, the tariff is a kind of a very, very volatile and dangerous weapon in the minds of neoliberals, and something that has usually worse outcomes than good outcomes. So the generalization of the tariff, which itself I would argue is an extension of the American reliance on sanctions as a way of doing foreign policy through the market rather than through diplomatic channels, is a real shift in the terrain since 2016 that has mostly worked against what mainstream neoliberals would want ideally from foreign economic policy.
And where does Robert Lighthizer fit in all that? Because he seemed to be an emerging important figure. I mean, for him, tariffs were not a threat, but were a form of industrial policy, even a form of fiscal policy, or the replacement of a fiscal policy, the possibility of a welfare state without union and without taxes. So the wing that you think is on the wane, but nonetheless, it's still there. A bad version of Lighthizer, which is Peter Navarro, is still in the administration. So
I had to think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, the beginning of the Globalist book sort of presents this moment where Alan Greenspan says, it doesn't matter anymore who is elected president because the world economy actually determines what policy will be enacted. It's hard now, I think, to put our minds back in that kind of late 90s, early 2000s mentality when politicians from left and right just took global competition and competitiveness as a kind of a natural force to which states could only respond kind of passively. You had no choice about the deindustrialization of formerly industrialized countries. You had no choice about the outsourcing and offshoring of all kinds of jobs, the shift into more precarious service work. It wasn't the politicians, it was the global economy that was holding the steering wheel, and all you could do was react. The benefit of this disruption in 2016, which I would argue was sort of led by Bernie Sanders and then co-opted by Bannon and given to Trump, is that in many ways the politics are back in political economy. I think that to be able to say that, globalization is not a force of nature, but is something that is an outcome of a series of policy choices, and that we can make a different series of policy choices to produce a different kind of globalization, is, in general terms, a great advance, right? In that sense, I've always been hesitant to condemn absolutely the kind of shakeup to global economic thinking that has happened in the wake of Trump. I think the fact that Biden's administration, took on and then even accelerated many of the challenges to global free trade orthodoxy that Trump had started is a good sign that even, institutional members of the left, progressives inside the establishment, also think that we don't just want to go back to the way it was before, that had lost legitimacy, it wasn't producing the best outcomes, so we need to think again about the balance of state and market. That, I think, is healthy and great. Unfortunately, I think that balance has been used now in pernicious ways by the Trumpian right, and the vision that was arguably more amenable to left-wing outcomes that Robert Lighthizer represented, in which, at least on paper, the idea of third-party investor-state dispute settlement was being questioned. The idea that corporations could sue countries for lost profits was something he was very suspicious of, which I think is correct. He was, and people in his trade office were trying to get things like labor standards put into trade agreements so that the ability to organize in a Mexican factory, for example, would be part of an agreement that the United States would agree to. The people who took over from him in Biden's administration pushed that even farther. We're trying to think about trade agreements that would protect goals of energy transition, would protect social rights, and would help to lift up the floor for people who were part of the newly created jobs. So I don't think it was ever a question of like tariff revenue replacing taxation of a general kind. You never make enough from tariffs to do that level of spending. But the idea that the state could arrange its relationship to other trading partners in ways that could be transformative internally towards desirable social goals is wonderful, actually. I mean, we need that. We need that approach of alternative globalization. It's just a question of what those internal goals are, and those that are shared currently by the Trumpian right are all of the worst ones.